It was an ordinary night, and the small town of Eldridge, a peaceful place with seemingly no terrifying stories, was beginning to settle in for another calm evening. The streets were empty, except for a solitary figure walking quickly along the sidewalks. It was Clara, a 22-year-old young woman who had just moved to the town and was still adjusting to her new home. She had rented an old house on top of the hill, away from the other residences, an isolated place that, at first, seemed perfect for someone seeking peace and solitude. However, this particular night felt different. When Clara arrived home, she felt an odd sensation, as if she were being watched. She looked around, but saw no one. The cold wind blew through the trees, making the leaves rustle uncomfortably. It was as if the air was charged with something she couldn't quite define. She sighed, trying to calm herself, but there was something in the atmosphere that didn't sit right. Upon entering the house, Clara noticed that everything was silent. The wall clock, which she had set to mark the time precisely, was stopped. The sound of the clock normally comforted her, but tonight it was absent, leaving the place even stranger. She took a step into the living room, but an intense chill ran down her spine. Her eyes adjusted to the dimness of the place, and then she saw it. On the wall, near the stairs that led to the second floor, a shadow was moving. Clara froze, unable to move, her feet heavy as lead. She blinked a few times, thinking it was a reflection or even a light glitch, but the shadow kept moving, as if it were breathing. Her eyes remained fixed on it, and her body trembled in a way she had never experienced before. Before she could think of running or screaming, a voice whispered in her ear, "You shouldn't have come here." It was a soft voice, almost inaudible, but it made her heart race. She quickly turned around, but no one was there. Panic began to set in, and she rushed up the stairs, feeling the presence following her, as if it were everywhere at once. The upper floor of the house was even darker. The wood creaked under her feet as she explored the empty hallways, trying to understand what was happening. She tried turning on the lights, but they didn't work. Her only guide was the sound of her breathing and the echo of her footsteps in the walls. Clara no longer knew what she feared more, the complete silence or the presence that seemed to draw nearer with every second. She made her way to the room she had chosen as her own, and there the feeling of being watched intensified. The door behind her slammed shut, and Clara quickly turned around. But nothing. Just the thick, cold air. Her mind was in turmoil, trying to rationalize what was happening, but with every passing second, her panic grew. She knew she wasn't alone. It was then that she heard the whisper again, this time closer, as if the voice were inside her head, invading her thoughts. "I warned you." Clara stepped backward, and as she did, the bed behind her shifted, as if something or someone were lying there. She looked toward the furniture, and, with a muffled scream, saw a figure lying with its back to her. The shadow of the figure seemed to contort, as though in agony. Its eyes were closed, but Clara knew she shouldn't approach. The figure looked strange, as though it had been taken from a nightmare. The whisper grew louder and more intense, as if the words were forming within her own mind. Clara felt like she was losing control of her own thoughts, being pushed into a state of utter despair. "You can't escape." It was the last thing she heard before everything went black. When Clara woke up, she was back in the living room, downstairs, and everything was silent again. She got up, dizzy and disoriented. The sunlight was beginning to filter through the windows, but something was wrong. The house was now in perfect condition, as if nothing had happened. There were no shadows, no whispers. She approached the front door, feeling as if she were trapped in some kind of illusion, and when she opened the door, she saw something that made her freeze. Outside the house, the townspeople were gathered, staring at her with empty, distant eyes. None of them seemed to move. They were just there, but at the same time, not there. The feeling of disconnection was so strong that Clara no longer knew what was real. And then a woman appeared among the crowd, her figure clearly visible, but in a strange way, as if she were floating in the air. She had a peculiar smile, and when she approached Clara, she whispered once again, with that soft voice, "You're trapped here now, like all the others." Clara tried to run, but her legs wouldn't respond. She was paralyzed. The woman continued to smile, and then disappeared into the crowd, which continued its routine, as if nothing unusual were happening. The house, the townspeople, and the town itself were all surrounded by a fog of mystery that Clara could not unravel. What had happened there didn't make sense. But one thing was certain. She would never leave Eldridge. The house had claimed her, and all who once entered there were now destined to live in an eternal cycle of nightmare. Now, all who enter Eldridge know there is no escape. Those who dare to walk the empty streets become part of the town's history, their presence eternally etched in the walls that whisper. And perhaps, at some point, someone from the outside will hear the scream of one lost, who, like Clara, is now just a shadow in the mist. But no one will ever find the exit, because, in Eldridge, the doors never open for those seeking freedom. They close for those who dare try. The days began to pass, but the feeling of disconnection never left Clara. She tried, at all costs, to understand what was happening in Eldridge. Every time she left the house, she felt like the streets were too empty, as if the whole world was watching her from a distance. The townspeople were no longer ordinary people to her. They were shadows, figures disconnected from reality. She no longer knew if what was happening was a product of her mind, or if she was truly trapped in some kind of eternal nightmare. The most terrifying moments occurred at night, when the shadows stretched, and the silence filled the air. Clara could no longer sleep without being awakened by that chilling whisper, repeating in her mind like a twisted lullaby that would never let her rest. You can't escape. One particularly cold night, Clara had a desperate idea. If she could leave Eldridge, perhaps she could break the cycle. She felt that the town was holding her captive, as if it were a cursed place, and the only way out was to leave and never come back. But when she reached the train station, the town seemed stranger than ever. The houses around her were shrouded in a thick fog, as if time had stopped. The train was there, stationary, but there was no one in sight, no employees, no passengers. She boarded, with a sense of urgency, but as the train began to move, Clara noticed something even more disturbing. The landscapes passing by the window weren't real. The trees, the roads, the mountains, everything looked distorted, as though it were being manipulated by some invisible force. She looked around, desperately searching for any sign of normality, but every detail seemed out of place. That's when she saw a man sitting on the other side of the carriage, staring fixedly at her. His gaze was empty, lifeless. Clara, horrified, stood up, trying to move away from him, but her feet were glued to the floor, as if some unseen force had paralyzed her. The man didn't speak, but his eyes were filled with a dark wisdom, as if he knew exactly what Clara was going through. And in that instant, he whispered, "You won't escape." The train slowed down, and reality seemed to warp once again. The carriage grew darker, and a thick mist began to envelop Clara, until she could no longer see anything. The whispering grew louder, and Clara felt a sharp pain in her head, as if something was trying to invade her mind. Then, with a jolt that seemed to tear her soul apart, everything stopped. The silence was absolute. Clara opened her eyes and found herself back in the house, in the town, with the feeling that nothing had changed. The city, the people, the house, everything seemed the same, but deep down, she knew that nothing here was real. More and more, she found herself trapped in a nightmare of her own. But there was something else. On one of the following nights, when the whispers had become unbearable, Clara heard something different. It wasn't the usual soft voice that haunted her, but a deeper one, older. It was as if the place itself was speaking to her. "You don't understand, Clara. This is not your home. You were chosen." She ran through the dark hallways toward the basement, where something was calling her. The place was filled with dust, the walls cracked, and the smell of mildew spread through the air. But when she looked down at the floor, she saw something. She ran through the dark hallways toward the basement, where something was calling her. The place was filled with dust, the walls cracked, and the smell of mildew spread through the air. But when she looked down at the floor, she saw something that made her freeze in fear. Strange symbols were etched into the stone, forming an incomplete circle. She didn't know what these symbols meant, but she felt they were the key to everything. She kneeled and touched the marks, and a wave of energy coursed through her body. Images of other townspeople began to form in her mind, people who had lived in that house before her, people who had tried to escape Eldridge but had never succeeded. Each of them, when trying to leave, had been pulled back into the cycle of suffering. Clara began to understand. The town wasn't just a place. It was alive in some way, and she wasn't here by accident. Suddenly, the whisper returned, louder than ever, as if the words were forming in her own mind. You've already made your choice. Clara froze. The weight of the truth was crushing. And then, the final moment came. She was no longer Clara. She was Eldridge. She had become a part of the cycle, a part of the city. But the real surprise came at the very end, when the screen of her YouTube video flickered, and the camera cut to Clara, now visible as a reflection in the camera's screen, watching the viewers directly. Reality had folded. And now, she was watching, waiting. Clara, the new guardian, was here. You're watching, aren't you? Clara said, her voice soft but full of an unsettling presence. You knew, somehow, it was too late. The camera abruptly cut off.